All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Justin Barch. I am the Executive Director at SCB. And before we get started with the webinar, I wanted to take a moment to thank our sponsors for today's webinar. A big thanks to BioLife Solutions, the New York Blood Center, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, Army BioFab USA, and Regenix Bio. We really appreciate your support. We're a 501c3 organization, and your donations allow us to put together events like the webinar today. So thank you again. We'll be having many more opportunities for sponsorship in the near future. So please make sure to sign up for our newsletter, post on social media, and you can always reach out to me directly. My contact information will be displayed on a slide later in the presentation. Leading our discussion today will be Dawn Hankey. Dawn is the Senior Scientific Program Manager at SCB. Dawn has led a number of our working groups around consensus-based standards. Dawn interfaces with the FDA on a regular basis, so she's in the perfect position to help lead our webinar today. With that, Dawn, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Dawn Hankey, the Senior Scientific Program Manager at SCB. Thank you for joining us for our workshop on the Voluntary Consensus Standards Recognition Program for Regenerative Medicine Therapies and the FDA guidance that's come out for comment. So next slide. Today we wanted to go over a general welcome and some expectations for this workshop, and then delve into the regulatory viewpoint on standards and how that's viewed from the regulatory aspect, and then an introduction into FDA guidances in general and this specific guidance, and walking through kind of what this guidance entails and some of the implications for this guidance. And then we really wanted to focus a lot of the time today on discussion and on the guidance and opportunity for commenting and questions for this guidance. So we can talk about the commenting period and really what is of concerns on this guidance or any questions. And then delve into some next steps and what we're going to do for the next steps as for this guidance and how we're going to approach the FDA and the commenting period and our plans for that approach. Next slide. So I wanted to welcome everyone for joining us today, and thank you so much. We all appreciate all of your input and your viewpoints, and would love to have a great lively discussion for this workshop. But I want to go over some expectations first, so everyone kind of understands what how we're going to run this workshop and what we're expecting. Next slide. So thank you for your involvement and participation. We really appreciate that all participation and views are welcome and appreciated. We do want to give opportunity for asking questions, speaking up, and having a great lively discussion on this topic. And it's a great opportunity for us to come together and incorporate our various viewpoints from all the different organizations and the different people involved when it comes to standards, regulatory aspects, as well as regenerative medicine development. Next slide. SCB, I want to start with a little bit of general background on SCB. SCB is a nonprofit that was launched in 2017. We're a 501c3 that really serves to help as an unbiased group to help further the development of standards for regenerative medicine. So we don't have any vested interests in specific scientific, commercial, clinical, or policy approaches, and we're not an SDO. So we're not an organization that actually develops standards, we're not a standards developer or sells standards for purchase. Rather, we're here to help coordinate and facilitate the experts in the development process. So helping bring together those experts and helping facilitate those conversations that really need to happen to allow that collaboration in standards development and really identify what the needs are for the whole field and help put resources behind that to get the standards that need to be developed to move the field forward developed. And we're really the communication vehicle amongst all stakeholders. We also want to make sure people are aware of what standards are out there, how they can access them, and how they can implement them into their processes for regenerative medicine product development. Next slide. So the goal today is really to talk about this new guidance that the FDA has put out on their recognition program for voluntary consensus standards that's open for public comment period currently. And it's really to bring together organizations that are involved in regenerative medicine to talk about this guidance and provide a forum for discussion on this topic and on this guidance, so people can be aware of really what this guidance is and what it implies and its implications, as well as give an opportunity for conversation and discussion around what comments need to be submitted, if there's any concerns or questions around this guidance in general, and how this recognition program will proceed. Next slide. So as far as expectations for this workshop, really everyone will have the opportunity to share their organization's role and viewpoints and be part of the discussion. Participation is voluntary and to the level of the comfort for the organization, so you can really speak up or share whatever you feel comfortable sharing. And discussions are conducted in the spirit of cooperation and collaboration. We're really here to work together as a community. Please mute yourself. We have quite a few people on the line if you're not speaking. If you have a question or concern, please go ahead and put it in the chat or raise your hand. We'll call on you to speak up, or we'll read out your question, but please do that instead of having everyone speak over each other at the time. If you'd like to set up any questions privately, please send them to Katie Zander in the chat if you didn't want to share them with everyone in the whole group, and we'll make sure that your questions get addressed and brought up to the group. I really appreciate all of your help and cooperation in making this a smooth workshop. I know sometimes it can be a little difficult with virtual workshops. Thank you. So I wanted to jump into kind of a general overview on standards before we jump into the specific guidance itself. So there are a lot of benefits to standards, and they're really important in the regenerative medicine field. They have quite a few different reasons. There's quite a few different reasons to consider standards and implement them into your process. In general, the development of standards, discussion between the subject matter experts can help encourage collaboration and knowledge sharing across the field, which really benefits the whole field. Standards that help guide in innovation and help guide implementing processes and things and through frameworks and discussion points can really help facilitate innovation and product development. They can help guide you through that in a more streamlined manner. They can reduce costs to manufacturers and patients because they can streamline processes and implementing processes, which will reduce time and cost. And they also really build public support for new therapies. A lot of these regenerative medicine therapies are novel and not fully understood by the general public or embraced at this point. And really having solid standards that are being used and followed and created by the cutting edge field and the actual experts in the field can give the public confidence and help build support for these new therapies. And as part of what we're talking about today for this guidance, they can also really accelerate the regulatory review process. You know, when you're going through that approval process, use of standards can be really beneficial. And it can accelerate that because there can be a clear communication between the sponsor and the regulatory agency about your process and what standards you've been following, and there can be that understanding a little bit easier. So it can in general accelerate the regulatory review process. So there's quite a few benefits for embracing standards in regenerative medicine. Today, we're mostly talking about documentary standards, which are written documents containing technical specification or criteria. They act as written rules or guidelines or definitions or characteristics. Those are the main focus of documentary standards. There are also reference standards, which are more physical standards that can be used in many different ways for calibration, for validation, and those kinds of things. And those are highly characterized reference materials. But a lot of what we'll be focusing on today and talking about will be mostly about these documentary standards. I have a few examples here. We have, you know, there's many different versions of documentary standards. There are very specific standards that can go into detail about a specific process or specific assay, such as a standard method for automated colony forming unit assays. And this really goes into, this is an ASTM standard that goes into detail about the imaging, acquisition, and analysis for enumerating and characterizing cells in colonies and culture. And that can be one type of standard. And there are other standards that might be more broad and framework approaches that really help guide you through the fit for purpose decision-making process in certain situations, such as the ISO standard for general requirements and considerations for testing and characterization of cellular therapeutic products. And those are just two different types of examples of documentary standards. And really what we're also talking about today is mostly the consensus standards process. So the consensus standards process is a specific process that is following 5 main principles and guidances that ensure openness, balance of interest, due process, an appeals process, and consensus. And those are the 5 main tenets of a consensus standards process. So this really usually involves balloting, opportunity for commenting, opportunity for appealing a standard, and also really critically having a revision schedule for a standard and making sure that it's still accurate and still appropriate for the field. And so we'll mostly be talking about standards that are created through this process and through organizations through this process. Now, most organizations that follow a consensus standards process in the US are accredited by ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and that ensures that they follow these 5 main tenets in their standards development process. There's a lot of legal basis for the use of standards in the regulatory process. There's many different points where it's pointed out that it's preferred. The use of consensus-based standards process is preferred. So there's the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, both of which clarify the use of standards as preferred. It's also further clarified in multiple different FDA guidances, such as the Standards Development and Use of Standards in Regulatory Submissions reviewed in Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, and the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards in pre-market submissions for medical devices. So really overall, in general, the government stance is summarized by the fact that agencies shall use such voluntary consensus standards for test methods, procurement guidelines, management systems, sampling procedures, and protocols to determine whether established regulatory limits or targets have been met. So it's a pretty clear stance by the government that it's preferred when possible to use voluntary consensus-based standards. And this does include during the regulatory approval process for regenerative medicine products. And in order to understand a little bit of what we're talking about today, I wanted to make sure that we addressed the differences between regulations, guidances, and standards so that we know what we're talking about. Today, the main focus is going to be on this new draft guidance by the FDA, which is slightly different than a regulation. So a regulation is something that's put out by a government agency that has the full force and effect of a law and is mandatory, setting out specific requirements and really very clear law that must be followed. Whereas guidances are documents that are put out by, excuse me, that are issued by a government agency to really clarify the agency's viewpoint on and thinking on existing laws or regulations that are out there. So they go into a little bit more detail on how you can actually comply with some of the regulations that have been instated and guidelines for how to follow those processes. But they do not have the force and effect of law and are not necessarily mandatory, but they do really clarify and are really important in showing the government's thinking and what they're expecting and would prefer as far as in the approval process, specifically as we're speaking here about for regenerative medicine products. And standards are not put out by government agencies, but they are voluntary rules or conditions, characteristics, or physical materials that can be adopted to make a process safer, more efficient, or better aligned with the practices of the general industry and other organizations within industry. As I mentioned before, different standards types can include the documentary standards that I talked about, which are actually written documents that go through guidelines and process characteristics and processes for how to follow standard or a standard that's written like that. And there's also standards reference material, which can be a physical material that can be used for validation, calibration, or other assays as needed. And there's also standards reference data, which can be a compilation of a data set and data that can be used for comparison and used to help advance your assays and your data analysis. So as I said before, our main focus is talking about this draft guidance, and what an FDA guidance specifically is is something that's released by the FDA itself that does not have the force and effect of law, but is not meant to bind the public in any way unless specifically incorporated into a contract, but that it's intended to provide clarity to the public regarding existing requirements under the law, and that FDA guidances can include FDA guidance documents, including this guidance, should be viewed only as recommendations unless specific regulatory or statutory requirements are cited. And that it means that it is suggested or recommended, but not required. So this guidance has been put out as to clarify the FDA's thinking on the use of regenerative medicine standards in the approval process, and really to clarify this new program that the FDA is intending to launch for regenerative medicine standards, and informally recognizing certain regenerative medicine standards. So this guidance that's been put out is following on a few other guidances that have been released by the FDA that are similar and or relate to standards for regenerative medicine and relate to this guidance. So there's previously been released the appropriate use of voluntary consensus standards in pre-market submissions for medical devices. And this standard describes the appropriate use and documentation of both FDA recognized and non-recognized consensus standards for pre-market submissions, and how the FDA staff intends to rely on consensus standards during the review process. And this guidance provides further clarity and explanation about the regulatory framework, policies, and practices regarding the appropriate utilization of consensus standards for pre-market submissions. So generally, this outlines for medical devices the thought process behind the use of voluntary consensus standards in your approval process, and kind of how the FDA views that. And so it's a really critical standard that is following that, and is kind of a basis for some of the FDA's thinking on voluntary consensus standards use. We also have a similar guidance that's been released by CDRH, that is the recognition and withdrawal of voluntary consensus standards. And so this is a guidance that that describes the procedures that the FDA follows and the actions that the FDA may take during its review and evaluation of requests for standards recognition or the withdrawal of recognition. This guidance provides further clarity and explanation about the regulatory framework, policies, and practices regarding the FDA's recognition and withdrawal of recognition of voluntary consensus standards. So this is a very similar guidance that's been released previously by CDRH that explains a similar program for recognizing voluntary consensus-based standards for medical devices. And so that is part of what this new standard is based off that recognition program. Not based off of, is similar to that recognition program that CDRH has launched, but this will be from CBER and specifically for regenerative medicine standards and for use in regenerative medicine standards. So now I'd like to talk specifically about the guidance that we're here to discuss today, the draft guidance that's out for comment. So this is the Voluntary Consensus Standards Recognition Program for Regenerative Medicine Therapies. And this is a draft guidance that has been released by CBER for comment. So it's open for public comment for the public to provide feedback and questions and any sort of comments that they would like to share with the FDA, so the FDA can take those into consideration before this guidance is finalized. So the draft guidance was released for public to see on June 16th. And there is currently the comment period for the public to provide comments is open through September 14th. And I mentioned that the center that has released this is CBER, and it is really overall modeled after that program that I mentioned earlier from the medical devices. So it's modeled after the Formal Standards and Conformity Assessment Program, or SCAP for medical devices. So it's specifically a guidance describing a new program at CBER for the recognition of voluntary consensus standards that are relevant to regenerative medicine therapy products that are regulated by CBER. And it also goes into detail about how CBER intends to review those voluntary consensus standards to determine whether they are appropriate for recognition. And it will not apply to legally binding regulations, such as certain provisions of the laws, the FD&C Act and the PHS Act. And it applies to standards that are developed by STOs that follow consensus-based processes and not non-consensus-based processes. Okay. So it's really intended, let me go back to this one. So this is the program that has been, that this is modeled after. And there's currently in CDRH this database that lists standards that have been formally vetted and recognized by the FDA for regenerative medicine or for medical devices. And so the intention of the standard is to model a similar process for regenerative medicine therapy, voluntary consensus standards. So a similar way of having a database that lists and acknowledges recognized voluntary consensus standards to what already exists for CDRH. So this guidance is really intended to facilitate product development. So it's intended to use the agency expertise to evaluate and vet and recognize voluntary consensus standards that are related and relevant for regenerative medicine therapy products, and that will be useful for CBER's evaluation process. Specifically, it's intended to help CBER receive candidate voluntary consensus standards with relevant information so that you can submit standards that you would like them to consider. It will also allow CBER to determine whether to recognize a standard in whole or in part following the internal evaluation. And it will also allow CBER to list those recognized standards in a searchable database on CBER's website, accompanied by the information explaining a little bit more about the standard scope and the intention of CBER in recognizing that standard and any relevant information about that. This guidance is also intended to provide transparency to the industry and stakeholders regarding CBER's thinking about a particular method or approach, thereby increasing regulatory predictability. And it's also intended to promote the visibility and use of standards that are applicable for regenerative medicine therapies, and really increasing the understanding of the field in that use of standards and in what standards are out there for regenerative medicine therapies. So this guidance lists the expectations of these standards that the FDA will be vetting, and that anything that FDA recognizes should not conflict with the FD&C Act, the PHS Act, or any other regulations or current policies. That the standard has to be scientifically sound and can assist in the assessment of regulatory submission for regenerative medicine therapies. So it needs to be relevant for regenerative medicine therapies approval. And that use of the standard may facilitate the ability of a sponsor to meet the regulatory requirements for RMTM, or for regenerative medicine therapy products that are being reviewed in CBER. So once again, that it's very relevant to that approval process for regenerative medicine therapies. And those are the main points that the guidance explains that the FDA will be using to evaluate these consensus standards and whether to recognize them or not, and that it must meet those criteria to be recognized. The guidance also goes through really what information, if you have a standard that you would like the FDA to consider for recognition, what information you should include and how to submit that to the FDA. And that includes basic information such as your contact information, the name of the SDO and the title of the standard so that they can be accessed, any designation number or recognition number that needs to be there for identification of the standard, a proposed list of products that the standard could apply to. So to show how it is relevant for regenerative medicine therapies, as well as a rationale for the request and a reasoning for the request, and a brief description of the testing, performance, or other characteristics of the regenerative medicine therapies product or processes that would be addressed by those proposed standards. So really that relevant information of how is this standard relevant to regenerative medicine therapies specifically. And so this is the criteria for the public or anyone to submit a standard to be considered for recognition. And so once that has been sent to the FDA, it will be internally vetted for those main criteria that I mentioned earlier, and they will release a list of standards that they have assessed and formally recognized and create a database similar to the database that this guidance has been created based off of for the medical devices. So with that, I wanted to open up to the discussion portion of this workshop to really determine what kind of feedback we have from you guys as stakeholders, kind of figure out what questions or concerns you may have, and really delve into more of that conversation about this guidance. So I also wanted to highlight, as we go into the discussion, please, we would love to have your feedback. Anyone is welcome to speak, but please either send your comments in the chat or raise your hand in the participants so that we can do this in a fashion that we won't have people speaking over each other. We do have a searchable database that we have created, a standards coordinating body, that lists information on many different standards that are relevant to regenerative medicine therapies. So this is also something that really plays into and can help assist in understanding what standards are out there and could be applicable as far as this guidance is concerned. And standards that really exist and could be considered for recognition. So this is a searchable, filterable database that we've created of more than 280 regenerative medicine standards, as well as 42 areas of standards needs that have been identified by stakeholders. And it can be searched by keywords, sector, functional area, as well as the standards development organization and others, to be able to find what standards are out there and what's relevant. And so this is really critical when you're thinking and considering about this guidance, what standards could be applicable and could be considered. So I wanted to, like I said, open this up for the discussion portion. And I have a few prompts and questions, but I'm really open to any comments or feedback or questions that you guys have as experts. And so I don't know if we have anything in feel free to add anything into the chat. If anyone has any questions or comments, or go ahead and raise your hand. But I wanted to start in general for consideration. Are there any questions on the guidance or how it will be implemented or anything about what it contains?
These slides will be shared. Ooh, we have a question, Don.
Yes. So we have a question. Are they willing to promote standard development through funding and actively participating on the working groups to help develop these standards? As the first question. So nothing in this guidance discusses funding as far as for the development of standards. I do know that there are many FDA participation in the development and in these working groups of developing many of these standards that are relevant for regenerative medicine therapies. So there are quite a few, there's quite a bit of FDA input on, I can't say all of the standards that are under development, but on many of the standards that are under development for regenerative medicine therapies. And on many of the standards that are really relevant and likely to be considered, I believe there is early and active FDA participation on quite a few of these standards in the actual working groups. And then are CAR T cells included? Yes, as far as the FDA understanding and their general terminology on regenerative medicine therapies, CAR T cells is included within that category. So it would be applicable. Although I can't say that in every case, it can be product specific depending on variances in your product, but there are many CAR T products that would be applicable under this regenerative medicine therapies umbrella and would be applicable for this guidance.
Another question, when asking the health authorities to consider a voluntary consensus standard, is there a need to also provide submission approval precedent?
Sorry, when asking the health authorities to consider a voluntary consensus standard, is there a need to also provide submission approval precedent? Oh, so based off of this, in order to get them to order to submit a standard for consideration, there does not necessarily have to be submission approval precedent. It does not have to have been approved. Part of the information that is requested to be sent in asks for its relevance, but nothing specifically says that it has to have already been used in an approval process. So as long as you could justify its reasoning and how it could be used in an approval process, that should be enough to be able to submit it for consideration to the FDA, is my understanding.
And Judy from the FDA just replied no in the chat.
Yes, so thank you, Judy. We also have a question of where can I find the draft standard, and that is in the chat as well. I believe it was in some of the registration and things, but we've also sent it in the chat. And there is later on as one of the last slides, I believe we also have the link as well, and we will be sending these slides out, but feel free to check that link out and actually see the draft guidance for yourself and the wording for the draft guidance. We also have a question of, will they adapt the existing standard as is, or with an understanding or agreement that they can adopt it? So this is not that the FDA will be changing any standards that are out there. That's not the intention of this guidance in any way. The voluntary consensus standards that are out there and are published are already out there and published and not necessarily going to be changed by this guidance. So when the FDA is considering recognizing a standard, they will be looking at the standard that is available and that is published, not any adaptation or changes to that standard. With the caveat that it does in the language in this guidance say that they may recognize it in part. So it may not be fully recognized for everything stated in that standard. But if it is recognized in part, my understanding is that the FDA will provide clarity on the part that is being recognized, so that that's clear. But they will not be changing the standard that is published, if that was the intention behind that question.
Sorry, it's me, Christine Roberts. That was my question, because I know from my understanding that there are parts of a standard that they may want to adopt or they may want to pull in, but they may not take the entire standard or everything within the standard. That's why I was wondering, what kind of criteria do they look at as far as, okay, to be selective, what part of the standard are you in agreement with? What part of the standards that you're not? Because it could take away from the actual meaning of the document.
Yes, I think that's a very valid point, and that is a very important concern and discussion, and I think that is something that maybe should be discussed further and included maybe in a question to the FDA or for clarification. My understanding is that that was part of what will be doing when they actually have their internal, I don't know what word exactly they use, but their internal process for consideration will be looking at the standard and trying to, I'm sure that they will be trying to minimize any large impact in general to the overall meaning of the standard itself. But I think that's a really important consideration that needs to be maybe considered as a comment or a question to the FDA. Is there anyone that has anything else they'd like to add as far as that point on that partial recognition and how that could affect a standard or the implementation of a standard? Okay. Let's see, we also have a comment that at ASME, the FDA actively participates in committees that they have an interest on. Generally, it's more of reaching out to the FDA and making them aware of the committee and soliciting their participation and making sure that they are able to provide comments and feedback in the commenting period and providing it as part of that consensus process. And I think that's a great point. And I think that's not just, I think that's something the FDA does definitely with ASME, but they also do it with many of the other SDOs, as I mentioned earlier. They are part of that active consensus process in the development of the standards in many of these cases.
And I apologize, Don, I was asking you questions on mute. There's another question in there that I think ties pretty well to their process, and that's how long is the approval process for the recognition of a standard? Do we know?
That's a great question. There's nothing here in that gives a specific timeline for that approval process. And as far as they haven't gone through that yet with this guidance, so it's really hard for me to give a lot of feedback on that. I know that I'm sure that they will not be waiting. I'm sure they have behind the scenes been already thinking about that and those timelines and how to do that and how to get these standards recognized quickly, but that is not included in the guidance, any information or timelines, from my understanding.
Don, is there something in the guidance about how frequently they will release approved standards?
I believe in the guidance it mentions that it will be, and I think if anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they said that it would be bi-yearly that would be released. So that would mean every 6 months it would be released, any new standards that have been added or anything like that, that the database would be updated at that rate. But please correct me if I'm wrong anyway.
I will check.
That is my understanding.
While you're answering the next question. The next question is, what is the best avenue for engaging with FDA on candidate voluntary standards if a sponsor has questions on their data package? So basically, when you put together your package for submission, is there someone you can talk to make sure you've done it as you think you should? And after that, Christine has her hands up.
Yeah, my understanding that, the best first thing would be definitely looking at that list of what's been recognized very critically. And I think that should be done early on. Personally, I believe that should be done early on in the process, long before you're actually submitting for your approval. But as far as engaging with the FDA, I think you really need to take advantage of the pre-IND meetings that are available and those formal meetings with the FDA, that those should be questions. And that's a great avenue to ask those questions of the FDA, especially if you have ideas for specific standards that you are considering. So taking advantage of those opportunities that you get in those meetings, I think is really critical. And is really one of the best avenues for getting feedback, because as each product is specific. You know, each product is variable and different. And so the best person to ask it is the FDA themselves during those consultations and those pre-IND meetings that you have available. So taking advantage of that opportunity, I think, is really the best. And then Christine, if you had something.
Yeah, actually, I was just wanted to point something out. We follow an ANSI process, which is the American National Standards. So at a minimum, every 5 years, each standard has to be reviewed and or evaluated to see if there are any updates to technologies, blah, blah, blah. So if you submit a standard that has gone through the ANSI process, say that standard was adopted or accepted by the government as a VCS. If that document gets reviewed again in 5 years or even before 5 years, will they keep their original document, or do you have to go through the process again for reevaluation of the 5 years, every 5 years that you go through it? I ask because if they've selectively pulled out what they are accepting as a VCS, then they're not considering any changes to the original standard if it has been changed or modified. So they're not looking at the most current rendition of that standard.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's going to be an issue.
Excellent point. And I think that's maybe something else that could be brought up in some of the comments to the FDA for clarification on that. Because is my understanding of this guidance, there is nothing specifically that talks about the revisions of a standard and how those are addressed. My understanding, part of what they have listed here as the intention behind this and of the function behind this is to allow a little more flexibility than regulations that are, you know, much harder to, and even guidances that take a long time and a lot of discussion and time to revise. So part of the intention is because voluntary consensus standards are revisable and they have that timeline of being looked at and considered on a regular basis, that really is a benefit to this program, is that it will allow the FDA to recognize these standards and also keep up to date on these standards as they are revised and things. So I believe that is the intention, is to make sure that they are up to date, although there is nothing called out specifically in this guidance about how that will be addressed.
So a couple of things. Judy says they will re-review them.
I saw that. Yeah, I was good. Thanks, Judy.
And there's two other things. Yes, it is twice a year. Also, Brandon pointed out that CBER intends to decide on recognition, complete or partial, or non-recognition within 180 days from the date of the request is received as resources permit. So if at all possible, within 180 days.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Although they have said that based off that every 6-month revision of the list, I don't know how that will be addressed, whether it will be a response directly to the person who has requested it for consideration, or if it will be part of the list in 180 days for the public to see. I'm not sure that that's clear.
If I had to guess, and Judy, anyone please correct me if it's wrong, that they will reach out to the person who submitted the standard within 180 days, but will only update the online database twice a year. Yes, Judy. That's correct.
Yes. Yes. So as far as that response, that's very, the FDA has been clear they'll respond to the person who submitted the request within 180 days, so there'll be an answer. But the standards list will be updated on a 6-month schedule. So, yes. Any questions or comments on the guidance itself or how it will be implemented?
Don't see any questions, public or private, and I don't see any hands up.
Okay. So what existing regenerative medicine therapy standards do you have a question about? Do you think should be suggested for the recognition? Are there any that you think should be suggested for the recognition program, or that you're questioning or had any specific questions about as far as this guidance is concerned?
I'm sorry. I don't want to
Yeah.
take over. Yeah, we have a couple that could be applicable, and I think that are on your SCB list that we would be interested in submission for consideration. But what I have to wait, of course, when the process is solidified, so that way I can go ahead and submit it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep. So I'm just kind of sitting on them. And it's nice, again, that you got a point of contact to talk to. So,
I actually have a question. I'm not sure if I don't remember reading it in the guidance. Will the FDA be reviewing standards, only the standards that are submitted to them, or will they be looking at standards in general?
No, the FDA will definitely be looking at standards in general. It's not limited to only things that have been submitted. That is just a great opportunity for the public to have them definitely considered and looked at. But I know that the FDA is not limited to what's been submitted as far as what they're considering.
And we have the suggestion of anything supporting the adoption of alternative and rapid testing methods. And just a comment that any standard should be considered to expedite reviews.
So I believe, for clarification, was that rapid microbial testing methods? Is that my assumption on that one? Saying that any standards that would be relevant? Okay.
Sorry for the lack of clarity there.
No.
Yeah, I think we're all, putting in a lot of effort and trying to get standards established to simplify the interpretation and adoption of rapid methods. And it's most of the complaint is about reinventing the wheel every time and having to educate reviewers, etc., each and every time. So any standard for kind of an emerging technology, whether it be rapid or not, I think would help specifically the cell and gene therapy greatly.
I have a question that's not public, but is it only the SDOs who can submit the standards?
No, anyone can submit the standard. Anyone can submit a standard for consideration. Like I said before, the guidance clearly outlines how to submit and what information should be included for that submission, and anyone is welcome to submit a standard for consideration. It does not have to be the SDO themselves or the subject matter experts that have written the standard. It can be anyone at all, even the general public.
And Christine, do you mind clarifying your question a little? What representative are you talking about? So the question is, if a representative is given access to the SCB list, and I believe the SCB list is public, would they be willing to look at it and flag what they may want to look at further? And yeah, the SCB list.
I guess I was looking at the ownership. So granted, the SCB list has multiple SDOs that have submitted standards that are available. So again, if the SDO, say there's somebody that's not on today's call, it's not privy to, accesses this information and knows this has taken place. Is there any ownership on the government or on the FDA to say, here's an SCB list that encompasses all of these SDOs that have applicable regenerative medicine documents? Maybe we want to look at this one. I wonder who this individual is. Maybe this SDO would want to submit. So I guess I'm looking at some type of joint ownership of just to see what's out there. And I point out the SCB list only because A, it is public, and B, it encompasses more than one SDO. So you're not showing any type of favoritism or preferential treatment for any SDO. So it's just a nice database to go to see what's currently there. So I didn't know if they would be interested in looking at that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, like you said, it is public. The FDA has access to that database and can see all the information there. And I'm sure that they've looked at it. I think it's quite a comprehensive database. So I'm sure they haven't looked at, every single standard in that list of 280. So definitely flagging any of those and sending them specifically to the FDA, I think is a great idea so that they can be called out and be definitely considered. But I think that it is a resource that I think is useful for the FDA to be looking at when considering their standards, because like I said, the standards that they're considering do not have to be submitted by the public. They could be anything that the FDA thinks might have interest. They could look at that and consider them. So they could be looking at the portal and considering those for sure. And I think that also leads to you guys as a public, if you guys have a standard that you see isn't on the portal, or a standard that you've submitted to the FDA that isn't on the portal, please, I think it's a great opportunity for you to maybe let us know at SCB so that we can make sure that it's added to the portal, so it can continue to be part of that resource for the public to find, because we are doing what we can and what we research and we find. But if we've missed something, please let us know. We can add it, and that way anyone can find it. So while you're looking for standards for this program to submit for consideration, please feel free to send the list of anything that you come across to SCB as well, to make sure that we can incorporate it into our public portal as well. I think Lexi's had her hand up for a while. Lexi, if you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn and Katie, for this. My question is more about beyond publicly posting things on the portal. I just wanted to understand, is SCB going to be kind of funneling the standards that are being put on the portal forward, or is it going to be other people's responsibility? So this is tangential to the draft, but I wanted to understand SCB's role and how you guys are thinking about this as well. Thanks.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that one thing that I don't know that because we would be submitting anything regularly to the FDA, as far as, because some of that information that needs to be included is specifically about how it could be used in the approval process and how it would relate to specific regenerative medicine therapies. And since we at SCB are not actually producing a therapy or have experience in that specific information, but I think one thing that we might be able to help with would be if anyone wants help in writing that request. I think it's something that we could provide some guidance and some expertise to help that happen. If you guys have a standard, but you don't know exactly how to, or what information you should include or how to do that, I think that might be something that we'd be able to help with. And if we do come across something that we feel is appropriate for us to share and fill out with the FDA, I think we would definitely do that. But like I mentioned earlier, I think one of the specific things that we have to include is how it can be used in the approval process specifically and what therapies it would apply to. And I think in many cases, as far as SCB is concerned, it might not really match our expertise to submit that information specifically, but we'd be happy to work with the experts to do that. And there may be cases where it actually would make sense for us to fill it out and submit that, if that information is clear and easy to understand generally as far as the field is concerned, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I heard you saying kind of case-by-case basis, but in general, users of the standards should be making sure to put them forward because of how it will help their products best. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I think that makes a lot of sense because they understand how it applies to their product best, but I think it's something that we can help with if anybody has any questions. We definitely want to make sure that these standards are being considered. So if anybody wants help in making sure that that process is followed, I think we're happy to provide help with that.
And I think it's worth noting that sort of indirectly. So one, FDA had a hand in the creation of the portal, so they're very aware of it. And just by keeping the portal updated, and those of you from SDOs, and well, anyone helping us keep the portal updated, because we know it is a resource that is used, just having things to date in the portal will help the FDA see them, because again, not everything has to be submitted. They're just going to be reviewing things as they come out as well. Well, some of them as they come out as well.
Yes, I agree. And I think also, even just outside of this guidance and this recognition program, having the standards that are applicable in that portal is really useful, because it's helping people find the standards that are applicable to them and access them and think about them earlier in the process. If they have that easy access to find them, they can find them and start thinking about them earlier than a lot of cases of where it's harder to find and harder to access those standards. They may wait until later to learn about them or find them. And so I think making sure that we include those standards to the portal in general is just better for the whole field and for industry. So please let us know if there's anything you think needs to be included. So we have, just wondering if they are looking at it and have particular standards of interest for this platform. I don't know if anyone from, say, the ATCC is on the call, but they have a good portfolio. I guess I'm looking for them to take some joint responsibility of getting the right documents to the FDA platform. So I think one of the things is just making sure that anyone can submit this to the FDA, and it's really important that if you're using a standard, maybe you should consider submitting it for the FDA. If you found it and you're using it in your process, any standard at all, it might make sense to submit it to the FDA. Right? Any questions or anything else about existing standards that maybe should be suggested the recognition program, or anything about the standards that may be applicable to be suggested?
Can you review what standards, what the requirements of the standards are to be accepted into this program? Recognition program?
Yeah, let me go back.
I know you mentioned it, but I think now that people have got their heads around it, it might be a good time to review it.
Yes, sorry about the flipping through the slides. Hope I didn't give everybody a headache. So in this guidance, it calls out that the specific the criteria that's being evaluated is whether the standard conflicts with current laws or regulation. The standard is scientifically sound, and in general makes scientific sense and is accepted by the field. And then if a standard can assist in the assessment of a regulatory submission for rapid microbial testing, or for regenerative medicine therapy products, and if use of the standard would facilitate the ability of a sponsor to meet the regulatory requirements for regenerative medicine therapy products that are being reviewed in CBER. So those are the 4 criteria that are being evaluated. So if you submit a standard, or the FDA comes across a standard that they're thinking about or considering, those will be the criteria that they're considering about what, and if it meets those criteria, then they may recognize it, I guess, is the main point. And overall, it's really around, does it scientifically make sense, and does it apply to regenerative medicine therapies, and will it help that approval process for regenerative medicine therapies? Can it be used in the approval process for regenerative medicine therapies? And those are the main criteria. Was there any questions or any clarification on that criteria?
I just want to add, just like, we're steeped in the whole consensus process, but I know everyone isn't. And if you go back to the draft guidance, there is a list on what these voluntary consensus standards are, and they have to have the openness, balance, due process, appeals process, and the consensus. And I think that's just also important to remember that that is required for them to be accepted into this recognition program.
Okay. Great. So I also, this is a great way to ask questions or have discussion around comments that maybe you think should be submitted during this public comment period for this draft guidance. So are there any questions or concerns, with how this recognition program will approach the differences, between typical standards for medical devices or general pharmaceuticals versus the types of standards used for regenerative medicine? So I wanted to, mention that a lot of the standards for medical devices or pharmaceuticals are straightforward, more clear protocols and or assays that might be a little more of a typical standard. Whereas a lot of the standards that are concerning regenerative medicine therapies at this point there are some that are like that. There are also quite a few that are broader and maybe more framework or fit for purpose decision-making kind of process or matrix approach process to approaching some of the considerations for regenerative medicine therapies. Are there any questions or concerns about how this recognition program would consider those the differences between those typical standards that maybe they've thought about before with the previous document or previous recognition program that's been launched by CDRH versus this new one with CBER?
Do you guys understand what we're asking here? Okay. And Don, someone asked in the chat if we have an example of a published standard that didn't go through an SDO. And I'm not sure if what they're asking is didn't go through an SDO as in didn't go through the consensus process. Bob, is that what you mean? Like one that wouldn't be considered a voluntary consensus standard that has been published?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
That's exactly my question, because I always thought when I heard about this guidance that they had to go through a consensus process. That was the whole point.
Yes, exactly. Exactly, Bob. So this is a recognition program specifically for consensus-based standards. So anything that hasn't gone through a consensus process would not be considered.
Which by definition means it has to go through an SDO, correct?
Yes.
So the whole thing is what you mentioned earlier on your slide, that there really must be a consensus process. So there's the question where you can challenge some statements that are made and get a resolution.
Yes,
Absolutely.
exactly. So that means that, if some organizations might put out a guidelines or an SOP or something like that, but if it was within an individual organization or just their general process, that really would not be considered in this case.
That's what I
It
would
would not
think,
be a
yeah.
consensus-based process.
I have one related question, and it's a larger context. Because we're writing a standard for collagenase. But the issue I come across as I think about this is, although we can write methods and whatnot for, say, in our case, assays for collagenase, the difficulty is, what do those assays mean? So I can look at it in one respect as, well, if you follow the standard, you must verify to the FDA when you make a submission why you think the number you're using is the right number. On the other side, and this has happened in emerging fields like the whole molecular pathology assay society was developed because of a lack of anyone addressing, really consistency and standardization of methods. So on the other side of the coin, I can see that you really need to have users and experts say, well, this is what you should be doing. And I think that comment came out before when you mentioned the ASME. But I think the issue that I see is where there's a gap is, what's the accepted practice and interpretation of a standard? And of course, the FDA won't have that. It's really expert committees. And I see this as, and I can see examples of how that occurred. I'm sure when the American Association of Clinical Chemistry was developed, that's why it started. But I was just wondering if you could comment on that, about the role these user societies, if you will, play in, influencing or using it as consulting to figure out, what is, even if you use a standard assay, what does the result mean?
No, I think that's a great question. And that's why I think in standards, it's always nice when you have that that section that helps guide you on the interpretation of some of the results of assays, especially when you're talking about, like you were saying, a specific standard that might follow an assay. But you're right, a lot of standards may not specifically explain or follow how to interpret or implement those results. And I think that that is a critical part of using standards, is understanding that. And I think that is open to interpretation and can have some differences in how people implement standards. I think that's one thing that would be useful to either, as standards are being developed, make sure you're including that information or that section in guidance on how to do that. But also, like you said, there needs to be maybe user groups that develop implementation guides or understandings after, so that if a standard is published, maybe that's not the final step. Sometimes there needs to be a little bit more information that comes out. And I also think a lot of times standards sometimes include really critical appendices, which I think is something important, that people pay attention to the appendices of standards. And that's just a side note, that on a lot of different SDOs, they don't necessarily want to include informative sections within the standard itself. So they'll have informative sections put in the appendix where they might have examples of how to do something, or clear interpretation and examples of how to interpret assay results and those kinds of things. And those can often be included in the appendix. So it's really important to pay attention to the appendix. Sometimes the appendix can be more critical than the standard itself, but that's just a side note as far as my experience with standards. But I agree that's a point. That's a really critical, important point, that interpretation can vary and can be something that we need to agree upon, at least to some extent, as a whole field, and as subject matter experts on a specific topic in general.
Yeah, that's why we started writing a guidance standard, because that information isn't in the existing collagenase standards. Mm-hmm. So you've got to be cautious in how you interpret your results.
I completely agree. And I think that's also something that could often be considered sometimes in the review cycle as well. Some people don't realize that you could include, now that you've had the standard out, you've had experience, you've had multiple people use it, there may be a little bit more knowledge about that implementation process. And as that review cycle comes up, or you want to review a standard, that could be included. that could be added sometimes to a standard. So that's also something to be considered as far as standards development process.
Right, thank you.
Okay. We have a comment of currently there's a huge discrepancy between the FDA and industry regarding the verbiage in HCTP regulation for regenerative medicine therapies. Companies are routinely getting letters regarding incorrect registration. So is that around just anything specific, or is that just in general point that maybe needs to be considered as far as this guidance, is that some of the standards may have verbiage that might differ from the FDA's?
Yeah, sorry, that
intention?
was my question. Yeah. More so, there's a follow-up question to that. Basically, how is the standard going to help alleviate its HCTP regulation is really vague, and I'm on industry side, so trying to interpret all of that and get it out to physicians is really not happening well, to put it nicely. So is that something that's going to be taken into consideration, i.e. breaking down the verbiage and really kind of getting standards around that, what the FDA regulation is?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Maybe that's something that could be asked. So obviously the FDA has not released the list of standards that they've considered or are going to be releasing once this guidance is finalized. So I don't know exactly what types of standards they are considering at this point, or have not considering. They have accepted or recognized at this point, because they haven't shared that. So I don't know if they will be accepting terminology standards or not. But in general, I think hopefully through the formal recognition of some of these standards, that will hopefully share some of the FDA's thoughts on verbiage, because they will probably be considering that as they're considering the standards themselves for acceptance. They'll probably be looking at what are the terms that are being used. Does this match with the FDA terminology? Does it conflict with the FDA terminology? Those kinds of things. So ideally, this is a step closer, hopefully, even if they're not specifically accepting terminology standards. But hopefully this is a step closer to aligning on some of the verbiage, or at least sharing what the FDA's thoughts are on the verbiage, so that people can see that and understand that going into their approval process. Is that helpful? Did that help answer your question at all?
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
Thank you. Anything else on, the types of standards, or how the FDA will be looking at those types of standards, or differences in standards for regenerative medicine specifically? Okay. Right. And then I wanted to open up for just asking, is there any issues or questions or concerns with the process, outlined in the guidance? I think we've had a couple of questions that have come in, about timing, about things like that. But are there any other, things that maybe you don't feel are clarified in the guidance, or that there's, or maybe you might have a concern with, as far as the process?
Before we go on to that, there is a question privately. Does the guidance exclude in vivo gene therapy products? I don't see why it would. But what do you think, Dawn?
It does not call out an exclusion for that in any way. So it really focuses on the terminology of regenerative medicine therapies. So it follows really that FDA thinking on what those therapies entail. And my understanding is that in vivo gene therapies are included, but I'm not
certain on that, but that is my understanding. But definitely the wording does not specifically exclude it within this guidance. So if it falls into that regenerative medicine therapies category that the FDA considers, then it would be applicable. And anyone can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I do believe it is. Any questions or concerns about the process or how that would work or influence you as industry or organizations or sponsors? So I think one thing that I hadn't really stressed a lot earlier as I was talking through the guidance was that this is a recognition program that the FDA is doing. That does not mean you have to follow these standards. They are still voluntary consensus standards. So this list that's being put out, you are not absolutely required to follow them. The standards on the list. So, but it does really clarify the FDA thinking on what they are thinking as approaches to regenerative medicine therapies and what they would like to see and prefer. But it is by no means is it required that you follow the standards that are recognized on this list. They are still voluntary consensus standards.
But why would you not? Oh no, I'm just. But why would you not if you know the FDA will accept them? Just advocating for the use of standard.
So, and then I wanted to ask, is there anything that you guys felt was maybe not included in this guidance that should be? Is there any points or anything that should be addressed in the guidance that's maybe absent?
And before we get into that, I also just sort of want to remind people part of the purpose of this webinar. We are writing a response to the FDA to submit into the docket for them to say this is what our stakeholders think of this guidance. So the feedback that we get from you all today, we are going to share in that response. So yeah, please let us know.
Yes, we are doing that. I was going to explain a little bit in the next steps about how that will work, but I think Katie is an excellent point that we're trying to compile, what the general stakeholders in the general field are, what we've heard and what we're hearing from SMEs as part of our comments on this. So please, if you have anything that you think we should be either discussing here or any points that we think we should definitely be sending in our comments to the FDA, please let us know. Please bring them up. We're happy to include that in our letters that we'll be submitting for the comment period. But is there anything that you guys feel like that should be addressed in this guidance that isn't?
So Dawn, I have a question, and maybe we can't answer it here, but we've been pretty clear on what we're submitting and what we're thinking about, right, in this whole process, right? So it's just which is cool, right? But what's really gnawing at me is that do we get a sense of what other people are thinking about and or submitting that is not involved from an SCB standpoint, right? Is there like this unknown out there that we're just not, we don't we don't know what we don't know, right? And is there a set of topics or issues that people want to be dealt with, but they haven't shared it with SCB? And is there an avenue for us to become more aware of that?
Yes, definitely. I think that's a great point. We definitely want to make sure that we're listening to that. You know, if there's any avenues that aren't being addressed that need to be.
But not through SCB, because
Yeah.
I personally don't. I think the organization is doing a wonderful job collecting information and points for the people that are participating, right?
Yeah.
I'm talking about those other people outside of us who are not, not participating in SCB, and do they have a voice that, either one, we have not heard, or one, or two, they don't prefer to bring it through SCB. And what does that mean, right? I know it sounds negative. It's really a positive statement for SCB, but is there other stuff out there that we don't know about, right?
Robert, if I could just, I don't know if it's possible to address your question. I think the answer is probably yes.
Hard, yeah.
But from ARM's perspective, we directed our members to SCB because this is in SCB's wheelhouse. So that's over 430 organizations. And I'd say, at the risk of sounding immodest, most of the major players in the industry. Now, did some of them choose not to be involved? We can't answer that. Even when we organize guidance commentary among many of our members, there's always members who choose to independently submit comments on their own. So I'm sure that'll probably happen here as well.
Yeah. Okay. But it clearly it's not an indication of the good job you're doing a great job. It's just, you never know what other people are doing, right? And saying, So.
Yeah. I think though that you will be able to view them, the comments after the deadline on regulations.gov.
Right, and that'll be very
Absolutely,
interesting time period, right? Great.
Yep. I'm not 100% certain. I know on regulations that I believe all comments have to become public. I don't know if that's true on guidances.
I think they have to be made public. I don't think they all have to be responded to. I will go double check.
I believe that generally they are made public, even for guidances, but I don't know if they're fully required to or not.
If they aren't, for whatever reason, we can ask the question more broadly. And I think, you're not going to get the full picture, but I think people would be happy to say, our organization commented and our comments were consistent with SCB, or no, they weren't. And here's why.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one thing that we as SCB, and I know you're talking about outside SCB, are planning to do is once we've put together our comments that we are going to submit to FDA, as well as our general letter of support that we'll be submitting, we will share that publicly. We'll put that on our website so that everyone can see what we are submitting as SCB, what we've heard, and what comments we have. And I think that, to Mike's point, I think that's a great thing that we'll also ask, with putting that out there, is this consistent with what everyone else had heard? Is there anything that varied, to try to gather that viewpoint of maybe stuff that wasn't submitted through SCB, like you're saying, and see if there's differences. But I think that was our plan as well. I don't know how much we'll get as far as people telling us what they said differently, but we definitely plan to share what we've said publicly and ask if there's anyone that has any other input that maybe we didn't consider. And
John, I checked, there are always comments in the dockets of the FDA guidances that I can see. And I think to a certain point, if people are communicating with us and aren't going through us, there's only so much we can do to communicate that.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question. A huge hole in regenerative medicine is guidance on designing potency standards. Likely reflects that we are still learning about mechanism of action. And yes, that is true. Potency is something that I think everyone in the field hears often and frequently as a variable that is of concern. And so I think potency standards are important. So we have just done a, excuse me, have just done a feasibility assessment on potency and functionality measurement methods, which I believe is available on our website. And then as a next step to that, we do have a working group together that is working on potency standards. So we've talked about a couple specific standards that could be addressed as far as potency, and they won't, address everything. By no means is that even possible in a single standard, but that is something that we are working on, hopefully trying to help move forward. In that is a working group that we've just started and pulled together, just working on our scope statement right now as a group. So if anyone's interested in getting involved in that or has questions about that group, please let me know. But I think that, yes, potency standards are a huge concern and a very common question throughout the industry.
Don, I put my email in there if people are interested in joining. No, I didn't. I just sent it to Don. I'm going to put my email in the chat. So if anyone is interested in joining that potency group, just email me and I can let you know what it's about and add you to the invite if you're interested.
Mm-hmm. But that is a really great group. We've got a lot of really good subject matter experts that are really passionate about that topic. So I think it's a great working group to get involved with if anyone has interest in that. But back to the guidance, is there anything that we feel needs to be addressed in the guidance?
And I just sent the link to the potency feasibility study.
Okay. And this is just a general question, is this guidance likely to increase, your organization or in general industry's use of standards? Do you think this is something that will have an impact and will increase the usage of voluntary consensus standards?
I think personally, if there's a document coming from the FDA, in general, people will pay attention to it, and so therefore, just having those 3 letters in front of it is going to create some attention to it, right? So right. I think it's very nature of the agency and guidances obviously have been around for many, many years. This is not new to regenerative medicine, right? The traditional pharma and biotech have seen guidance documents for, who knows, 30 years now, maybe more. And so people are aware of them. People understand that they're important documents to reference. And if you choose not to, like I said earlier, I wouldn't understand why person wouldn't, but if they choose not to follow them, they're setting themselves up for a lot of work, right? to justify not to do it, right? So.
Mm-hmm. And I think to that point, and part of what I think is important to address, and maybe in our responses to the FDA as well, is really I want to get your guys' view on this guidance. Is it going to be a positive thing? Are you guys supportive of this guidance, or do you guys have hesitancy on this guidance or issues with this guidance? Because in general, I'd like to kind of hear what you guys think as the stakeholders, about this.
Can we touch on a couple of questions in the chat before we open it up? Or there are a few questions in the chat about the guidance itself.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone know what vetting mechanisms are to be used to filter out the non-applicable documents from what can really help the industry? So my understanding is really based off those tenets that those evaluation criteria that were set, that were called out in this document, is really how they're evaluating them and filtering out non-applicable. And it really will, in my understanding, depend a little bit on that portion that when it's submitted of explaining how it is relevant to regenerative medicine therapies. And so that is really what they'll be considering, is that section, that information, you know, how it is applicable is really one of the things that they're going to be using to filtering out non-applicable standards. And part of that is going to be, you know, what products is it applicable for? And what products is it applicable for? And, you know, how can it be used in the approval process are the two main questions that they've specifically called out in that evaluation criteria as far as applicable versus not applicable, if that makes sense. We have, as long as it's clear what portion of the standard they support, if not in full, CBER's formal acknowledgement is more of a promotion of the fact that they exist. I agree. That's part of what this recognition program is for, is to promote the fact that they exist, but also to promote the fact that the FDA acknowledges those standards and finds them relevant for regenerative medicine therapies, implying that they can be used in the approval process, that they are something the FDA has considered a good, a standard that is applicable to use for the approval process. So it is both that promotion that they exist, but also the promotion that they are not just exist, but are applicable for regenerative medicine therapies and for the actual approval process. But I think that is like one of the main, one of the critical benefits and positives of this guidance is that promotion of existence and the promotion of encouraging usage of those standards.
Support of the use in a way.
Yeah, there's a fine line of what should be called out specifically in the document and what should be left for interpretation. Should it be more prescriptive? I think that is really to use what is said often. That depends. It's a case-by-case basis on the specific standard. Some standards really need to be prescriptive. They need to go into detail about how to implement and how to evaluate the standard in order to make them useful. Whereas some standards need to be left open for interpretation in order to allow for innovation. I wish I could give a more specific answer on that, but it really does depend on the topic of the standard and the scope of the standard on how prescriptive it needs to be a useful standard, or how much needs to be left open to interpretation to make it a useful standard. So it depends on the type of standard, but I think even in the standards that need to have more flexibility and more room for interpretation, like I said earlier, in part of the discussion that we had earlier, based off that question about implementation guides and those kinds of things, those can always be very useful documents that could be added or after a standard is left open to interpretation. That leaves that flexibility for the standard, but also sharing that information with the industry and with stakeholders to help guide them through maybe a specific scenario or how to interpret results can always be done. And that can kind of hopefully bridge that gap in those types of standards that need to be left open flexible. But that's something that needs to be considered, is that maybe a secondary document that gives implementation information or interpretation information could be helpful. Okay. So I wanted to open it back up to the question I asked earlier to try to get a gauge on your guys' feedback about your feelings on this guidance. You know, do you guys support it? Do you have positive feelings for this guidance that it will be helpful and good for the industry? Or are there any concerns or issues or hesitancy?
Is there anyone here who thinks it will decrease the use of standards?
Is there anyone here who I guess I can take silence as a support, but is there anyone here who doesn't support this guidance, I guess?
Hey Don, it's Simona.
Mhm.
I put a question in the chat and I was just, you know, this is just the one thing that makes me wonder, like if it's the standards are going to be looked at solely for their use in regulatory processes or their overall benefit to the field. And that might be something that can bias maybe eyes away from a standard, even though it exists, and it could be helpful to the field and how that might be able to be addressed.
Yes, yes. I think that's a great, really great point. My understanding, based off the language in this guidance, is that this list is really focusing on documents that are applicable for the approval process and the regulatory process. So my understanding is that it will not include standards that are not useful in the regulatory process. That doesn't mean that those standards are not critical or important or have a big impact or should be used, because they definitely should. But that is my understanding of this formal recognition process will be for standards that are applicable in the regulatory process.
You know, that's a little bit different than standards, you know, prior to this discussion, right? Standards from, you know, the standards, and I can many examples, right, where they talk about improving the design development of the product. They are used for purposes to ensure that the quality is ensured. I think it goes beyond, personally, it goes beyond just the submission process, right? I mean, that's just my own opinion maybe, but I think the standards, if you can look up some older standards, they all refer to, like, you know, improving the product quality, improving the process by which you develop your product.
Mhm.
I think that's a fundamental challenge, right, for the space, right? Is that how do we influence people to do things a certain way so that not only do you go through the regulatory submission process easier, but it reinforces maturity into what we're doing as an industry, right? And that we're developing processes, applying equipment, automation control strategies, a whole bunch of different things that need to be matured up, right? And these guidance documents help people deal with that. I mean, I'm not taking away from the filing. The regulatory filings are extremely important. Don't get me wrong, but I think it goes beyond that personally.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The usage of standards goes way, way beyond that, and the benefit to the field goes way beyond that. And I think there are quite a few standards out there that would definitely apply, and there needs to be a way to get people thinking about those standards and considering those standards earlier, that they may not actually be what we're talking about specifically here as far as in the approval process, where they'll be on this recognized list. I think that's an excellent point, and I think we are trying to get the word out there. We're trying to make it easier for people to find the standards. And I think that's something that if anyone has any, suggestions or ideas to how to get that out further, get that word out and that understanding out further, we definitely have open ears. Because I think that is an important point and a critical aspect of standards for regenerative medicine is not just getting them written and developed, but getting
Utilized.
them used. Yeah.
Well, Don, I'm not, I haven't memorized the guidance document, the draft document, so I'm not sure, but if there isn't already a statement in the document that kind of recognizes that there are other types of standards that are really helpful for the field, but that might not be recognized because of their, disconnection from regulatory, it might be useful that a statement like that is recommended to be added to the guidance document.
Okay. Yeah.
I would agree with that. That makes sense. Yep.
Okay. Excellent point. Yeah, I think that's a great comment to submit. And we can double check.
Dawn, I would urge everyone to take a look at some of the previous guidance documents that are coming out of the FDA, because there's great examples in there of what we're talking about, right? I just, I think, when they first came out, I was around and, there was a lot of pushback by industry on guidance documents. People accused them of being, regulations in disguise and stuff like that, right? But people needed to realize that guidance documents had a place, right? There was a place where you can have more flexibility, an ability to understand better what you're trying to deal with, clarifying, concepts and points that may not have been in the actual regulations.
Mm-hmm.
I think all that really does apply here too. And so, for not asking people to read a whole bunch of other documents, but there are some great documents out there that really do point to these points, to the things that we're discussing right now.
Yeah, completely agree. Yeah.
I mean, Q8, Q9, Q10, those are great examples, right? Some of the E documents, etc. So anyway.
Well, something that might be helpful, we are planning to send everyone who registered for this webinar, we plan to send these slides as a follow-up, but maybe in that email we could also include some of these background documents that might be useful as well. I think that could be helpful.
Dawn, are you guys planning on putting out a survey with the questions that you have in this slide to collect more feedback from the participants?
We hadn't thought about that, but that's something we could do. Sorry, what were you going to say, Katie?
There's just not enough time because the comments are due on September 14th. I think it would be difficult to have a final document that way.
I mean, we could put it out. It would have to be a short time frame. If we got it out even, today, it would probably only be like a week. But, we could do that, and then just whatever we get in that week, we could use. I'm going to make sure we include if that makes sense.
Yeah, my only thought is it's the participants here. I think it's kind of difficult to answer all of these questions. If everyone answered all of these questions, we'd be here till 5. So yeah. I think that if people really want a chance to provide answers, a simple survey to just kind of respond a few days after this meeting could be helpful.
Yeah, and if we send out, that's another thing we could actually send out with the slides and the couple links to some other documents. Maybe we could send out the survey as well. So maybe people who weren't on the call or didn't feel comfortable talking could provide their responses. I think that's a great point. All right, with an eye on time, is there anything else that anyone wants to bring up or discuss before we move on to next steps? Okay, great. So for the next steps, we've included the link here. It was also in the chat earlier, but we've also included it here to actually access the guidance. And also any comments, if you guys want to submit comments separately on your own, please feel free to do so. Do so by the deadline of September 14th. That is the FDA deadline to submit comments. But it also there's a clear outline for how to submit the comments. It's just through email. So please do that if you have any comments you want to submit, but also please take a look at the guidance if you haven't looked at it yet. Look at it. It's not super long. It shouldn't take long to look at and go through, but check it, see if you have any concerns or comments that you want us to address or add. Feel free to email them or put them into the survey that we'll send out. And as far as next steps for what we're planning as SCB to help address this is that we will be sending 2 separate letters to the FDA in response to this draft guidance. We have a general short letter of support for this concept and this guidance that we plan to write and submit based off of all the stakeholder input we've had so far. We felt there was general support. But then we will also be sending a second letter with a detailed letter that will include some specific comments and discussion that we've had from the stakeholders before this, from this discussion here, what we've been hearing here, as well as anything you guys want to email us after or put into the survey that we'll send out after. We'll compile all those points and those discussion points and submit that as a letter to the FDA as well. And we encourage you guys to review review the guidance and comment on the guidance either through your organization or sending comments to us. But please, we encourage you guys to do that. We will also keep all of you guys who have registered for this workshop up to date on the progress of this guidance. So we will let you guys know. We have your emails. So if they put out the comment responses or finalize the guidance, we'll let you guys know that as well. We'll email you guys so you guys can be kept up to date on any progress of this guidance. Any questions or comments on the next steps? Okay. Great. Okay. Any questions or anything in general? And with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Justin for our closeout.
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. Great job. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And again, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. We really appreciate it. And there you can see my email. Please reach out with anything, whether that's volunteering for one of our working groups or responding to any of our feasibility studies, whatever it might be. I'm available, so please reach out. I believe on the next slide, we have some of our links to our social media. Again, I think Robert made a great point of kind of building a bigger tent for SCB. I think people that are involved with us see the tremendous value, are very much engaged, but we need to get more people in the industry involved. And a great way to do that is by following us on social media and sharing what we post. So we might post about need volunteers for working groups or responding to feasibility surveys, whatever it might be. If you could share that within your LinkedIn, you all are centers of influence in this industry, and it goes a long way, and they'll do a great job of expanding the footprint for SCB. So please give us a follow. Thank you. You're on mute.
Sorry. Sorry about that. If you have any other questions or any more information, please feel free to email me, Justin, Katie. Any of us will be happy to help, or check out our website for any more information, or our social media, as Justin just mentioned. But thank you all so much for joining today, and I hope that we've helped answer some of your questions and guide you through this draft guidance.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.